We don't even have an accountant. There's no legitimate.
We do have an accountant. They just won't respond to our emails.
Swords.
Oh, are we? Oh, I didn't know we were recording.
Yeah, we've been recording. We've been recording for like 4 minutes. We'll
just so you know, you're going to show
all
up on the
going in the episode.
Oh, God.
Well, it's a bonus episode. There won't be that many people. Well, fewer
exactly.
people.
No, a lot of people have that stolen
won't
link.
be.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Hey, if you're an accountant who wants to talk to us, we want to talk to you.
Put that in.
No, leave that in. Ours ghosted us.
Just talk over them with some actionable threats.
That's right.
Accountant ghosted us. The person doing transcriptions ghosted us twice. Who else has decided that we're not worth talking to?
Fake friends.
Our manager ghosted us.
Yes, also that.
What'd you say?
Oh my god. We're so good at business.
I don't know how this thing makes money.
I don't either. And neither does the IRS, apparently.
Through sheer force of will, people toss money at us. Despite our incompetence.
Despite our refusal to make a product in a timely manner.
Yes.
These are problems I wish I had.
I respond to emails basically as hostily as possible at this point.
Yes.
We had this is a bonus.
I wish it was like possible to learn this power or to teach this power, but it's not. It's purely by dumb luck. It's by accident. I don't know how this happened to us.
Did you see Manscaped wants to sponsor us?
Oh my god, fuck off.
It's like what Felix from Chapo, I think, summed this up pretty good, which is podcasting is incredibly easy and almost no one can do it good.
yeah. Least of all us. Hello and welcome to bonus episodes of Well, There's Your Problem.
Yeah.
You know who we are, but you don't know who our guest is. We have a guest. Hello, guest.
Hello, I am Guest. I'm Dr. Mark Geldof. I'm a historian of violence, specifically historical violence. And that's
incredibly cool job title.
Yes.
Oh, it'd be even better if I was paid for it, but as it is right now, no. This is still going on the CV, though.
Yeah,
I got a little bit of echo.
Yeah,
I think that might be. I'm not sure if that's going to be from Mark or from Liam echoing Mark.
I'm flat, so
yeah, I think it's me.
Okay. It's fine. It lends you sort of authority. You know,
we'll burn that bridge when we get to it.
Yeah.
Noise gate.
Just a couple of little points of echo. Just like, yes, I'm a historian of violence.
Got to do the whole thing with that filter.
Yeah,
please
Alice, why have you put a man in a thong with many things in him on our screen?
This is a wound man. This is from a medical textbook. This is how you would learn about different injuries. And the reason why there's a wound man, who I really quite badly want to sell as a t-shirt on your screen, is because we brought Dr. Mark on to talk about swords. And sort of our general sort of theme here is, how would you die in a sword fight before the year 1600 CE?
Thank you, Alice. Thank you for being respectful of my faith. Unlike Roz, who just shits all over it.
Wait, what? What am I doing?
You said CE. Roz always says.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I say AD because
that's a bad habit. It's a habit you shouldn't be blamed for. I mean, common era is a thing historians do just to mess with people about the current trends and practices in periodization. So one way or the other, it doesn't really matter.
That's a real long explanation for Roz is a dumb asshole.
It's the year of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Yeah, in your head, it's always the sort of like opening 5 minutes of what's the name of the Umberto Eco? In the Name of the Rose. Yeah, it's always the opening 5 minutes of the Name of the Rose, where you're like sort of on riding an ass towards a Dominican priory, and it's like AD. 1415 or whatever. But so we're going to talk about swords. We're going to talk about how they work, what they do to you, as you can see here, how and why people use them. and how we know all of this stuff, what the like historical record of all of this stuff is, and how smarter people than me, smarter people like Mark, can figure this out.
Well, the first big lesson is this is what we think worked, not necessarily how it actually worked. But this is the trade-off of getting a doctorate to come in and talk about historical topics, is that we're all very comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty and sort of very qualified conclusions. And most of the people who are going to watch these will be very upset with my wishy-washiness on it. But, that's all part of the fun.
Yeah, best guess. So I think we can just dive straight into it with the first slide, please.
Now, my understanding from television is that to use a sword, you find a guy with a funny accent, and he's very buff.
Right.
And the funnier the accent and the more buff he is, the better he's going to teach you at sword fighting.
Yeah, I think that works for the post-1600 period, which we'll touch on a little bit. But prior to that, and we do have some slides on the whole training thing specifically, but most people learned how to fight from people who had the same accents of themselves. They were just an
funny
awful lot.
accents weren't invented until the 1600s.
Yeah, well, I mean, funny's relative. But you started learning this when you were very young, if you were taught to do it at all. And then by the time you were old enough to travel and meet people with funny accents, you already kind of knew everything, or at least enough to get by. But
and how common is this, being taught how to sword fight or fight?
Well, for the first, the first question here is, how often were people armed? How prevalent was this sort of stuff? Was this, a daily occurrence of you having to sword fight your way out of the pub or something like this? And
Sure.
I mean, depending on who you read, it was a constant struggle for survival day to day. And other people will say, well, even the most unlucky might encounter 2 armed conflicts in their entire lifetime. So there's a variety of opinion on it, but for the most part, vast majority of people in the medieval period, be they in England or in Europe or wherever, rarely ever experienced armed warfare. They rarely had to actually arm themselves for their own protection. And if they did get into fights, it was not always, life or death sort of fatal stuff. There was a lot of violence in the sort of casual way.
From that time to this in England, pub kicking out times.
Lighting cop wagons on fire.
Yeah,
well, that's the thing. No cops
I
yet.
know,
So
I was just making a joke.
But that's genuinely a thing that drives it. Is like, if there's nobody to come and break you and the like printmaker's apprentice apart, right? There's a decent chance you're just going to end up stabbing each other or with something.
Well, what's more likely is that people are going to come and break up your fight because you're not surrounded by complete strangers all the time, unless you've moved to London when you were older and you're working someplace else. Urbanization makes the patterns of violence different. In the local community, though, everybody knows everybody else. Everybody's business is everyone else's business, so you have a lot of incentive to impose order and maintain peace and stuff like this on your own, independently of external influence. And as a matter of fact, the last thing you want is for the king's people to come in and start messing. So
the whole community comes home and comes together and says, "Go home, Carl. You're drunk."
Pretty much, yeah.
And go to bed.
but most of this violence, when it involves arms at all, it's not. We think generally involving a sword, right?
Well, there is a lot of variety in weapons, just as there is in arms and in the situations which you find yourselves in combat. And then there's the evidence we have for what combat looks like. I mean, we have the fun little illustrations from the Holcomb Bible. This is, when is this? This is 13th century, mid 14th, I think. And I mean, dedicated warfare, swords were pretty common. As a day-to-day sidearm, they weren't unless you were part of the social elite, and then it was kind of a mark of status.
Sort of a 13th century Pete Buttigieg being like, I didn't carry a bastard sword in Antioch, just to see it on the streets of Buckingham, you know.
To some extent, yeah. I mean, there's still debate about just how common people carried around swords. Certainly, people were armed. If you extend arms to include things like pocket knives, because everyone had knives, but a knife is different than a firearm. So
I've been trying to explain that to the police, and they don't get it.
Well, yeah, I mean, the definitions change.
It's fine in America. As long as you don't have knives that open in like 3 or 4 specific ways.
Yeah, cool
which
ones.
are functionally identical.
But yeah, the vast majority of combatants on a battlefield situation would be armed with not swords. Spears, axes, variations on different kinds of hafted weapons, bows, crossbows.
I gotta say, leaving the bar after insulting someone's maiden and then getting run through with a fucking axe at 2 a.m. Not a good time.
Just sort of like cresting the hill, coming back to the pub after an argument with my pike. Which incidentally is my sort of like listicle.
I gotta go get something from a trunk. I'm about to get something from my trunk, and you just bring out a halberd.
If you see a wagon with like a Molon Labe sticker on it, what that actually means is free pike.
You gotta leave that stuff outside.
Yeah,
you can just go home. You don't have to fight. You get on a horse and you go home. The horse isn't drunk. You are. The horse can bring you home. The horse might also fall in a hole and break its leg.
Horses are just dumb as shit.
Horses are the dumbest animals.
Yeah.
After birds.
So, yeah, in battlefield situations, the people who are armed with swords are usually people who are also in command. They're also usually the ones on horses. They're the ones that wear the most armor. And up until about the 16th century, they're the most important combatants because they're the ones who do the vast majority of the killing of other people who can do the killing. But sort of munition grade equipment is often referred to, the stuff you wouldn't necessarily own yourself, but people would collect and give you if you were forced to go and fight. That stuff was fairly common. But again, it's not the everyday experience. So the conclusion being vast majority of people in the medieval period didn't train to use a sword from the age of a toddler. That was the guys on horseback.
But I was taught in GCSE history that feudalism is when you have a big pyramid of groups, right? And at the bottom you've got your peasants, you've got your serfs or whatever. But they have to fight. They can go get called up. They can get levied. So therefore, everyone's a trained soldier, right?
Right. Well, for tax purposes, perhaps. I mean, the simplified system of that feudal pyramid does kind of hold up when you look at just how the money works, frankly, because you have the people at the top who are dependent on those below them to support, economically. But that's a different podcast for someone who's more qualified to bore you with money.
I remember I had a class at Bishop Ireton High School called History of the Church. It was the church history class, right? Which directly conflicted with the modern European history class we also took at the same time. And there was this nice piece in the textbook that explained how in the feudal era, the lord and lady of the manor personally cared for all of the serfs. And I took one look at that. And I was a dumb teenager, and I was like, this is the worst shit I've seen in my life. You expect us to believe that? Are you teaching kids in like Texas that shit? What the fuck?
Oddly enough, I mean, that is kind of what they taught themselves. I mean, if you asked a landlord at the time or the church, they would have said that's exactly it. And
they had to care for the poor, Roz.
And in the abstract, that is still kind of true. Although only the worthy poor, by the way. So people who had lost fortunes and who were now poor, they were worthy of charity. Those who were born poor, well, that's God's will. So there you go.
A mysterious act of God's love.
Yeah. The point about mandatory
fault.
Let's steer clear of that for a little bit. The compulsory military service thing on the books, like in England, they have legislation basically saying something along those lines as early as the late 12th century. In practice, what that mostly meant was that people were financially obligated to support military service. And so the easiest way to sort of legislate this was, say, if you've got X amount of land or rents or whatever, you need to have on hand this kind of equipment, which you are expected to employ at the request of the king. Now, that doesn't actually mean that everybody who's got 6 shillings worth of stuff per year needs to be able to go and fight for the king wearing the body armor and the helmet and the spear that they say they're legally required to have. How it usually worked out is that people and communities kind of collected all this gear and made it available to people who could go and fight. And as far as legislation was concerned, spelling that out, that distinction, wasn't really important. So that's the way to read that interpretation of this sort of pyramid system.
Everyone's got knives, and the government says that you have to have a barn full of such and such amount of tactical equipment. The Middle Ages is sounding better and better to me, I'll be honest.
Oh, it sounds like Montana.
Well,
I like central air conditioning. I like my toilet with running water. I would not have survived in any period other than this. It is baffling to me when people are like, "Oh, I was totally born in a different era." My fat ass enjoys walking 15 feet to get his cheese puffs. That is the extent of the physical the work I'm willing to do.
Well, there's also a separate thing happening here, Liam, which is your role in that big feudal pyramid is a square off to the side marked Jew, right? That's
fair enough.
It's actually a Star of David, and I stand in it like I'm trying to.
You could be the Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court.
That's true.
Except you'd be from Massachusetts.
Yeah, listen, I will say that if I were in charge of the Frankfurt ghetto, it would not have gone down that way. I would have John Browned that shit.
And you'd have been right to do it.
We would make Attila the Hun look like a pussy.
Thank you,
anyway,
Frank Rizzo. Mayor Frank Rizzo on the podcast for the first time.
I didn't use the slur. That's growth.
All right, this is.
I just wanted to point out the biggest. I mean, this has come up before, the notion that you get these guys now who hoard all these guns and stuff. The biggest difference between dude now in Montana with his Connex box full of guns and a titled landowner in the 15th century who has an armory full of equipment is that dude with the Connex box has no interest in sharing those guns with anybody else. Dude with the armory full of body armor has people he can then arm and go and do their stuff. So I mean, unless you want to support a kind of socialist rifle association mentality of community protection and things, you're kind of stuck with the gun hoarders. So anyway,
that's the nice thing about swords is there's no ammo you have to pay for.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, you just have to pay for like a guy to like hone it occasionally.
Yeah. That'll be my job in the feudalist commune. Is
blacksmith is not a bad job.
Yeah, I want to hit hot metal with a hammer.
That's true. If you like not being in unbearable heat all the time, but in terms of like your social
tolerating
position
heat
and stuff,
I'm already in unbearable heat constantly. It's been like 100 degrees for the past.
Just start home forging and really like get those rookie numbers. Get those numbers up.
Yeah, Ross, forge in the basement with all the dangerously unstable chemicals down there.
So this is this is where
the reason I haven't started doing that.
The training stuff, or
Yeah.
How do you learn the sword fight, and why do we have all of these cool diagrams of guys sword fighting?
Yeah. So if we go back a bit and you turns out that you are born into the right group and you do either get to or have to learn how to fight, sadly, up until about, again, post 1600s, you're not actually going to be learning how to do this from a book. These books are terribly cool, and we will talk about those. But again, like I said, most of this is learned kind of organically. You get toy swords and shields and little horses and stuff, and you, as soon as you can ride on horseback, you ride on horseback, and you play fight with everybody, and then you less playfully fight with adolescents, and then you do mock combat with adults. None of this gets written down. None of this is formally taught in like a classroom setting with a master or something like that. You learn it as you go. The benefit of this, of course, is that it becomes innate, that you just, you're like, Daniel Day-Lewis decided to only play one role and he started training for it when he was 8. That's what this is. It's the equivalent of NHL team playing some beer league team. They're both playing hockey, but one is playing a completely different level of hockey than anybody else because they've been doing it for so long.
Yeah.
Now,
same with getting a kid started in like go-karting to get into Formula One or whatever.
I mean, if that works, sure.
I'd
actually be cool if it did, but yeah.
that is the usual path, though. Is you start with you start with
Lewis Hamilton was
really...
like in a go-kart at like age nothing. And was like racing before he could like ever plausibly drive legally. Same thing, or like getting your kids into tennis, where they're still very, very young, in the hopes of like one day Wimbledon. That still sort of survives in the sport field. But yeah, there really is no equivalent with sort of combat sports or
like gymnastics, where you're a has-been at age 14.
Yeah, because you destroyed your hips.
Yeah. Congratulations, you have no tissue left. You're walking on crab meat.
Yeah.
This raises another point, which is something I'm most familiar with archery, which is does learning to fight in this way create not just sort of like muscle memory or psychological changes, but physiological changes in like the body's development? Do you have like a sword arm off of this?
And actually we meet a guy we know is a career archer because of the changes it made to his skeleton.
His arm, right?
Yeah, well, his arm and slightly off asymmetrical torso. You get the same thing with people who ride horses for a really long time. They have almost everybody after a while develops little bone spurs in the insides of their knees. So in skeletons, you can see who was probably cavalry or someone who fought on horseback or spent a lot of their life time on horseback. So you do get some evidence that way. So we have the physical stuff. Back to the training thing, though. So the text we've got here, this is from the Tower Armories or Leeds Armories Fight Book, produced sometime around mid-14th century. It's a set of instructions on fighting with sword and buckler, using a priest and a clerk or a sort of student as figures, and then there are a couple of illustrations with a woman who's named in the text Walpurgis. Now, this text, well, it's a traditional German name. There's a Saint Walpurgis, there's Walpurgisnacht. There's a whole, if you want to dig into it, there's a whole bunch of other academics talking about who this woman should or shouldn't be and why they picked her name, but whatever, we're not going to get into it. So these texts, they tended to be produced more for show than for anything else, and either are illustrated or have a little bit of illustrations in text, or you just have some that are just pure text. And they're usually kind of like study aids. So they're going to reproduce certain stances and certain guards and a couple of sort of if-then rules. So if you're in a certain situation, X takes up this guard, you take up this guard, da-da-da. That's often as far as they go. There's some later Italian ones that have a fairly complicated flow system where you can sort of mix and match the illustrations to produce sequences of events, which are really very clever. But no one's actually learning how to fight from these. People are just using these to show that they already know how to fight.
Brandishing my Fechtbuch at the guy outside the pub.
Yeah, well, I mean,
this is my pictorial pseudocode.
Yeah, well, there was a duke in Germany who commissioned someone to. Well, actually, no, this goes the other way around. There was a guy who wanted to get hired by a duke to train his sons to fight, and so he did an illustrated fight book just as a self promo, and you can tell because he skipped a lot of the stuff that's kind of hard to explain or to illustrate, or isn't as flashy. So that one really
mindset.
Is just
entrepreneurial
grind set, Alice.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it would be a grind set. You're right. Yeah. So.
Had to grind for this view, and the view is from the top of
my torso being distended. Yeah.
Hold me back, bro. Hold me back. I'm gonna fight it. Hold me back, bro.
But that's even a peculiar thing for the Germans because.
But you can't learn to fight from a book like this in the same way that you can't learn MMA from a YouTube video.
Now, I would say yes. Like you can't. You're right. You cannot learn how to fight from these books. Post 1600, though, there are authors who produce texts like this who claim that you could learn how to fight from the book. Other people who have fight schools would tell them that he was an idiot, and they would go on. And now
we invented the MMA influencer. We've gotten to Joe Rogan now. We've gotten to Andrew Tate.
There is nothing new under the sun.
God.
Yeah.
I hope that dude fucks himself in the ass with just a red hot porker.
There's actually
that's crazy. Have you ever tried DMT?
This English guy named George Silver who wrote his own book in 1599, and in it he has an anecdote about I think he was an Italian instructor who he talks about him, saying, "Oh yeah, you can learn how to do all this sort of stuff," and complaining about how this guy actually doesn't teach anybody how to fight. He teaches them how to get killed because he didn't teach them how to defend themselves. You're already getting into a little bit of this, but
a sort of a modern typology of the knife fight, which is the winner is the guy who dies in the ambulance.
Yeah, that's exactly what you start getting with the dueling craze in the 16th, 17th century. But
we'll
get there.
What I'm seeing here is the decline of civilization that started with the Renaissance.
Yeah, that's your pet theory. I have one of mine in here too.
Right.
Next slide, please.
Yes. Right. This one I put in here, and forgive me for monologuing briefly, but the whole bit about training brought this up. And I'm going to give it here, which I think will be the first sort of public airing of this theory. And for the swordbeards that will watch this, they may get kind of bent out of shape about it. But I'm going to point it out anyway, because it is a really good example of why that whole question about how do people learn how to fight is really hard to answer, and that you must embrace ambiguity and live with half-assed answers. So one of the things that gets thrown around is the traditional training tool being the pel or palas, this post you fix in the ground, 6 feet tall, and you practice your sword swings on it. Intuitively, it sounds like a really great idea. And it's actually mentioned in text by this late Roman military writer named Vegetius. He wrote, it's a bestseller, I think next to, what is it? Some stuff attributed to Aristotle. This was like the second most copied text in the medieval period.
But he got really transphobic on Twitter after that. It was kind of a weird vibe. A lot of his original fans kind of felt a bit alienated.
Yeah, he's nowhere near as popular as he was then. There's something like 120 of his texts survives, or copies of it. And in it, he has this little talk about
the Latin Vegeta.
I catch the reference. I'm not going to touch it.
Use a scanner to determine your opponent's power level.
So in his book, he's got this little.
How'd they
side
make
about
that
how-
work before electricity?
Yeah. You got like a little dynamo you spin really fast.
Yes.
I'll just let that play out. Okay. So he's got this thing where he talks about how Romans trained gladiators and their own swordsmen. And he talks about this, they use a shield and a sword that are heavier than normal, and they practice against this fixed post. Great. And that gets, of course, copied out into all the various permutations of Aegidius, people kind of plagiarizing his work and whatever. And historians in the 19th century run into this, well, this is how knights learn how to fight. There's the problem, though, that there is no other mention of the use of this post outside of texts based or copying Aegidius. And for all the stuff that they illustrate in medieval manuscripts, like all kinds of parlor games and chasing after, birds with slings to get them off of your field, or other sorts of ridiculous stuff, and knights fighting snails and other kinds of stuff. There are only these 3 illustrations of someone practicing against a post with a sword. And these 3 are all illustrations for French versions of Aegidius, 2 of which came from the same workshop.
Huh.
So basically the point is, everyone knew this was a thing you could do, or at least the people who were reading these kinds of books, but there's no evidence that anyone did it. So we get that problem of reconciling the 2, but having 2 things that are completely irreconcilable is a very kind of medieval thing. So
Yeah.
So we go.
So it's you could say either this is like this is purely a Vegeta's thing, and it's sort of like it's a curiosity that's depicted as such, or on the outside, this is so ubiquitous that it's like almost
why even write it down?
Yeah, exactly.
Sure.
Yeah, and I'm leaning towards it's just a Vegeta's thing, because everything else, no matter how mundane, shows up someplace.
Interesting.
So
I like how even 1,000 years ago they were making stuff up about the Romans.
Roz, you're really quiet to me. Is he quiet to anyone else, or is it just me?
Just a little.
Roz, turn your gain up the whole way and blow me out, baby.
Mr.
Rosniak, blow out these back walls.
I have 40 decibels of gain that I don't have right now because I need to buy a new XLR cable.
Well, it sounds
yeah, that's
fine.
Right. Bros. I love you, buddy. You know this. You are my best friend.
I'm going to buy both of you all of the audio gear.
I don't understand. No, we're not. I will take this. Take this fucking. Roz, this rant is for off air. Actually,
this podcast brought to you by not spending $7.
I am gonna take your share of the podcast money, and I'm buying a Miata with it.
Next slide.
Yeah. It better be a fucking Miata.
Okay.
It's not. I don't want to be here anymore.
It's an Aztec equivalent of a Miata.
I'll take it.
Yes.
Oh, it's like being in the Philly Museum of Art, the Sword Room. Yes.
So what I've done here is I've done the sort of the Riley question of what is a sword? What is it? What do we mean when we talk about swords?
Well, this appears to be a guitar.
Pirate young Alice on the 7 seas, cutting up Frenchmen.
You can try this with anything. If you want to sound smart, you're talking to someone who knows more about it than you. You just go. You take the subject of your interview and you go, what is X?
Okay. So I did that with the college bonus episode, and you made fun of me.
Yes. And now you can make fun of me in turn. It's the circle of life. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Alice eats, that's unoriginal. You don't eat your own poops. You do something far worse.
Great. Thank you.
Yes. So, okay, do you want me to try this, Ben?
Yeah, please try and answer my question of what is.
I don't want to interrupt the banter though, too. So.
Oh, no, that's okay. We deserve it.
So, the big thing about a sword is that you can't really use it for anything other than doing sword things with it. That's I think my easiest explanation for it. Knives, multi-uses. I mean, all kinds of people are constantly enjoying knives. Swords really only swing at people with it.
Right.
I mean, there's, I think, a boar hunting sword, but I mean, that's an outlier. No one cares about that one. But these are dedicated hacking away at people and or horses types of tools. They don't have a non-combat related function other than
I'm coming back to Pete Buttigieg again here. These are weapons of war, right?
Yeah. Now, I mean, some of them are more for actually fighting with than others. Some are just kind of for show. They indicate the person carrying them is of the sword kind of people. I mean, there's the distinction of the lords of the robe versus lords of the sword that French kind of concept gets into. But that's what they're for. They do mostly two things, which is cut or chop and stab. So you have penetrating wounds or penetrating actions and cutting actions. The two can be combined, and depending on what comes between the sword and its target, that can be converted into blunt force trauma, where you can't cut, but you're still going to be connecting and transmitting a great deal of force.
Yeah. You hit the dude over the head. You just hit the dude over the head with the claymore. The blade doesn't even matter.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, even the edge, even if it isn't sharp, still does a lot of the work in transmitting force. So, I mean, I still wouldn't want to get hit by, the rebated ones that lifesteal dudes use, unless I was actually wearing armor. Because, you get a guy swinging a baseball bat, making contact with you on 2 millimeters of surface area. That's, even if that isn't, well, it will cut you by simply percussive force, pushing stuff out of the way. So it doesn't have to be razor sharp to do its job. It just has to be swung properly, have the right kind of weight and balance to be controllable, and that's it. So you get these ridiculous variations in shapes and lengths and all that kind of stuff, but they're all still more or less intended to do the same thing.
Yeah.
The typologies and stuff we got on the slide here is mostly to help people date stuff or to figure out where things were made and by who. As far as, because you'll see why this is probably from the Oakshot's schematic for Viking period swords.
So, yes.
Yeah, where he's just illustrating the grips. All the blades are almost identical. You get a 400-year period where blade shape hardly changes at all, but the grips do, because that's more of an issue of taste.
It's sort of like the modern firearm, in that it's sort of like it's a good enough technology that every sort of like increment on it is sort of unnecessary.
Sure. You don't want caseless ammunition, Alan?
Yeah, I could do something completely different. It would just be very expensive and very speculative.
What if railgun? Yeah,
they invented the AR-15, and it's like, well, that's the best gun. We don't have to improve this. That's the best one.
We took the Sturmgewehr, and then we made the AK, and then the army turned around and said, but what if M16? And then, but what if M4? And there you go.
Some of the kinks out. It's a solved problem. The reason why I've put this Makwahuitl on here.
Wow, that was impressive.
Well, I probably got it completely wrong. The obsidian edged club here is my question is, why did we invent the sword? And why
not the obsidian club?
Yeah, why not the obsidian club?
There's two, and not joke, answers to that question. One, Aztecs or Mayans and Mesoamericans didn't have iron metallurgy on the scale that Europe did, so they couldn't have made swords even if they wanted them. So instead they used what was available. Obsidian is mind-numbingly sharp. This thing swung fast enough will cut through time. I don't even want to think of what this will do to somebody. And even though
I want a reenactment guy for this, where's my historical Mesoamerican martial arts?
It's way too hard to train with that safely. But also they didn't have to defeat armor, and I also don't think they were carrying around these things, on their hip, traveling. I think these functioned differently, sort of culturally, and then for combat purposes, different as well. So different situations requires different answers, but also they couldn't make them. They didn't have the I don't want to say technology because that's not true. They didn't understand metal work. They worked in gold. They worked in copper. They worked in other sorts of metals. They just didn't have iron. So.
And a lot of places did, and sort of like developed swords sort of broadly convergently, even with no like
more or less, yeah. There's it gets at that sort of evolution of it gets outside of my time period, but for the most part, yeah, that is kind of it. You do have a vague analogy between the sort of we've invented the AR. This is now more or less perfect. What do we do from this? Well, we want
useless ammunition. God damn it!
Sub-caliber munition. Do we want to go with really tiny cartridges, or the difference between 5.56 and 7.62.
Smart guns. Thank you, state of New Jersey.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, but the question of armor piercing versus soft tissue damage kind of thing, that does actually play out to some degree in the development of edged weapons, which we can talk about more on your next slide.
Fantastic.
So,
I will say there were other uses for swords, as demonstrated by back when SNL was good. The classic John Belushi sketch, Samurai Delicatessen.
Yeah, well, that's katana, samurai, Japanese type edge weapons, which is its own beast. So I'm not touching that one for now.
I did put a katana in one of the in fact the slide after this one, but it's mostly there for joke reasons. I wanted to talk about your smaller sword, your dagger, your knife, and what it's there for. Like on a spectrum from I use this to eat meat up to I use this to like poke into like gaps and joins in armor to kill Mr. Moneybags.
I use this to give people tetanus. It looks like.
That's gonna necrotize, baby.
Well, these two guys I think came out of lake beds or river beds or something. So I just got over saying that knives are multi-use sort of things, and of course they're on a spectrum where you have knives that are really only good for opening letters or cutting cheese, up to knives like the one at the far right here, which is practically a steel punch. It'll get in between gaps in your armor, but if you really need to, you can two-hand it and get your body behind it. If it grabs right, this could probably just make its manhandle its way through sheet metal. So
is this what you would call a misericord?
It's what people could, and collectors certainly did, call a misericord, as the mercy weapon once you've got the unwieldy armored knight on the ground and you finish him off. Most of that, of course, is complete fiction. I would not want to touch an armored person from the 15th century with anything other than 10-foot pikes, because they're never not dangerous. They're never immobilized unless you've got a dog pile on them, and that kind of a thing. That whole idea of we push this guy over in his full plate and he can't get up, that's I'm sure we're all familiar with that one. And it also being complete crap.
Me and 6 of my friends with pikes, sort of like hacking this guy apart, like the pool cues and Shaun of the Dead.
Your odds are better. They're not a certain bet, but your chances are better.
All right,
still expect to lose some fingers.
15th century knight versus Tom Brady. Who you got?
This is one of the things I will try and continue my streak of going every episode of this podcast talking about Disco Elysium. I think one of the things that Disco Elysium does very well is the terrifying possibility of an armored combatant, which it compares to wasps that get into beehives and just sort of kill tens, hundreds of their inhabitants.
Ross, what you should have said there was IRA versus Army of Knights.
Also, IRA versus Taliban versus Knights.
Also, this dagger on the left does have balls. It does have testicles.
No, it does have balls. The bollock dagger, that's totally a thing. And it is supposed to look like what it looks like. Apparently, overt masculinity to the point of it
That's
being
what I
almost
figured.
camp
Okay.
was a fashion trait. I mean,
Got it.
the cod pieces, the padded calves, because a meaty leg was a thing. So you had men wearing padded
Oh, I
stockings.
could go for one of those giant turkey legs right now.
Goes straight to your thighs.
Yeah, I mean it's and there's a lot of criticism of the fashions and stuff like this by throughout periods, pointy shoes or ornate hats or whatever you want. But this is also sort of it's yet another place where people who are in certain social strata can show off, and one of the ways you could show off was by offending public propriety. It's like, you're just walking around with that hanging off your belt.
Here's my ball knife.
Yep.
Yeah.
Let me adjust that belt so it hangs right over my cod piece.
We should bring back big striped pantaloons. Aggressive male fashion.
It is now time for Landsnack's core. I believe
this is another thing the Renaissance took from us.
But they also took a lot of body odor, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah, that's true. You have to carry around a little, sort of bowl full of spices.
Oh yeah, the pomanders with your little spices and stuff. Yeah.
You can take the good and leave the bad.
Yeah, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Next slide.
Sure.
Okay, this is the only katana that you will see.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I wanted to do was try to ask what a sword does to the body, what a sword wound is like. But
that's a nice boot.
Turns out, if you Google sword wound, you're going to see a lot of sword wounds.
Actually, what you're mostly seeing is a lot of people that have got shivved in prison. Very few of those are sword wounds. Some of them are actually machetes. I had a look. I mean, you don't want to look at my bibliography.
Yeah, go watch Surviving Edged Weapons.
Yeah. Well, what have I got? I've got. Oh, geez. I was going to try and find some of the papers I got. Oh, yeah. Applying forensic techniques to interpret cranial fracture patterns. No, I've got a paper on cranial stab injuries that's mostly from modern case studies.
That doesn't feel like fun.
No, but
it does to me.
It has a relevance for medieval stuff, which we'll get into in a second. Yeah. Same thing with papers on survivability from stab wounds. I've got one on that. If anybody looks at my interlibrary loan history from grad school, they're
sort of dripping with blood. Yeah.
Also, and of course, I recognized, when you put the slide up, I said, "Oh God, it's the Cold Steel people."
That's right, because I didn't want to put a picture of a guy who had been hacked open with a machete. So what I did was I used an image of a shitty hot metal wall hanging cold steel katana, and that it is, as you see, currently failing to cut into a cowboy boot full of meat. And the reason why I know that cowboy boot is full of meat is because at the end of this video, he literally sort of forged in fire, hammers it down enough that it splits this boot open, and it is full of meat.
Because he got it at Megatronics.
Oh yeah, that's a Megatronics sword. Right next to the $3 DVDs.
Yeah. So one of those sort of impossible to answer questions is, to what extent do we know? Are we talking about perfectly slicing through parts of people, and to what extent are we just battening a big sword over them?
They're both true, actually. Now, it depends again on the situation, what sort of stuff you're swinging, and what's getting in the way of the swings. But I mean, we do have examples of severed limbs and stuff. There's actually a battle we talk about in a minute here, where one of the bodies recovered had both lower legs taken off above the ankles, sort of in a, it's probably somebody with a halberd swinging downwards, caught both the legs and kind of cut through both of them. Didn't cut them completely off, because when the body was put into the grave, the sort of severed limbs were still attached by soft tissue. So they just kind of folded back onto the legs when they put them in. So that's how we know that they work that way.
That's an impressive thing that you managed to cut mostly through both legs, but not quite through all of them.
Yeah, I mean,
I wish they had just gone the whole way, right?
It's still getting through four bones.
I figured you get fully through one and then a little bit through the other, but no, you get mostly through both of them.
Yeah, and I mean that's a standout one that got its own photo in the book. But yeah, I mean, if you're fighting in a period in which most people are armored and you can't cut them, but you still want to hit them, you're going to hit them wherever is available to hit. You're going to swing as hard as you can to transmit as much force as possible. So, like I said, cut wounds can do all kinds of damage when there's nothing in the way. But if you do have armor on, it turns into blunt force trauma. That's kind of the mentality going on here. And we have ample evidence of that from the archaeological record. Less, of course, from soft tissue injury, because none of that stuff survives. You have to look at other sort of stuff, medical texts, accounts of battles, sort of anecdotal sort of things talking about people's injuries. But we got all kinds of stuff for damage to the human skeleton, which is...
which is, in fact, our next slide.
Yeah. And is to some extent independent from the literary record, but is still subject to a lot of interpretation.
And the course of doing that discovery and that interpretation is, I've written down here, for my money, I think it's some of the coolest work in academia going.
Yeah.
Just...
I wrote, actually, one of the main reasons why I suggested myself for this is because I spent an awful lot of time writing a paper that basically said that most people go too far with the CSI stuff. Although by too far, they really are too far. Like talking about how tall an attacker probably was, or whether they were on horseback, or which direction people were facing.
The moment when they started introducing facial reconstructions for TV, irrespective of how good the science of that might be, that's sort of the moment when I knew it was getting quite speculative.
Yeah.
In 1425, this man was personally killed by Hitler, who was still alive.
Hiding back in time, Hitler.
Yeah. Well, actually, one of the worst examples I've got is from, I think, 73. So, I mean, it's not a new thing. What is a new thing is historians like me spending a lot of time looking at stuff like this, which usually never got out of osteoarchaeology papers and stuff like that. So, or would show up in the background of documentaries. So that you are looking at sort of cutting edge. Oh God, sorry, I made the pun. Of some of the scholarship here in interpreting physical evidence of violence from a historical perspective. Yeah. Just happens.
This one on the top left is that's sort of broken bone. Well, it is, but that's a cut bone. That's
my guy's not having a good day now.
It's gone through the skull, the orbit of the eye, the upper jaw, and then almost into the lower jaw.
That's sharp force trauma to the face. Sort of force being delivered roughly 90 degrees to the face, kind of thing. Yeah, if there's nothing in the way. A 2.5 pound sword or a 6 pound pole axe will do that. And actually, that guy is from Towton, same place as the guy to his right. And I'm probably not going to be able to find him in the actual book here. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to tell you how many more times that guy was hit in the face, in addition to or prior to the one that goes straight across.
It's kind of,
but it's probably more than one.
It's a little hurtful, I would think, to be on the losing side of a medieval battle, which is one of the worst experiences you can have in the medieval world. And then 500-600 years later, for people to be like, "Oh man, that guy got owned."
Got, yeah.
Well, it's funny. It's funny you say that because to some extent, depending on who this guy was, he might think this is the greatest thing ever because there's all these other guys who got killed in the battle. I mean, if you believe some of the numbers, Towton was the bloodiest battle in English history, upwards of 20,000 fatalities. I don't think that's actually the right number, but it was a lot. And not a lot of people talk about people who got killed at Towton, but here we got this guy. Some people went and put his skull back together. We don't have his name, but we're still talking about, due date a sword. Wow.
They may examine our skulls 1,000 years from now after the gender wars.
Yeah, like here's the thing.
Calipers, yeah.
As a trans woman, right, I'm less concerned with whether or not future archaeologists look at my skeleton and go, was this person born male or female? I'm more concerned with them counting how many sword wounds I absorbed, whether or not it's a record, and speculating whether or not it counts if I was unconscious for part of it.
Well, yeah. Oh, yeah. It was, I feel worse for the guys who they find who have a bunch of wounds, say, all around their head. Like, I mean, bottom left here, he's got a cut wound to the front, and then there's an oblique one to the occipital of the back. And there's probably some archaeologists who look at this and say, oh, yeah, this guy was running away from battle, or he was a prisoner, he's executed. It's like, you have no idea. If you sat there with, like, I don't know, around Christmas when you've got, empty, the used up wrapping paper rolls, pretend it's a sword.
To bonk someone on the back of the head. Yeah.
Put it on someone's head and then walk around keeping it in place. See how many different orientations you can get without changing the angle of your strike. And all of these, reconstructions about, this guy was attacked from the right, who's, this kind of thing, they all fall apart because you get a dozen more completely viable orientations, which, especially in a battlefield situation, is exactly what you're going to get. So, dude on the right, I think it was 12, 7 sharp force, and the rest were blunt force trauma to kill that guy. But he was probably hit all those times within a very, seconds by 6 or 7 guys, all within arm's reach of him, all hitting him such that he'll die as fast as possible, because there's no such thing as overkill here.
Yeah, I don't want to go to the sword wound gangbang.
and especially the guy on the right, who we get to talk to later on about survivability, because this is not his first rodeo.
If you're going into these situations, these melees, right?
This is a Vikings fan at the Birds game.
Yeah.
I am going to go and fight in France, right? I'm going to go and fight in Burgundy or whatever. I don't want to die. What do I do? Next slide, please. What do I do to not die other than use my innate fighting skill? Well, that too.
You gotta sort of David Byrne big suit.
if you don't have a choice about just going home, your next step is to avoid pitched battles, which is pretty easy in that period. I mean, these people aren't idiots. They're not going out of their way. Well, depending on who you are, you're not going out of your way to get into a scrap with other competent people.
Yeah, we're getting into the Alice theory here.
The survivability onion is always relevant.
Yeah,
it is genuinely the best graphic I've ever seen.
Right. Do not be penetrated. Do not be killed. Yeah,
if you can't avoid that, then yes, you gear up. And that, the effectiveness of this depends on what time period you're talking about, how much money you've got access to, all of that. But
you need your PPE. You need your PPE.
Impossible to do a whole spectrum, but I put in 2 examples. Yeah. The most English man to have ever lived on the left here, and Mr. Monopoly on the right.
So you get your mid 14th century, almost universal European gear, although this stuff specifically is copying a set of body armor from Sweden. And then, gentleman on the right, that's the harness of, Second Earl of Pembroke.
And it screams, "I am important," which has a lot of possible uses.
Although looking out of that thing looks like a bitch.
It's not that bad, because it's actually not that very far. It's not that far from your face.
No, true. Okay, good point.
So you get the slots, and I mean, this is a foot combat sort of parade or tournament type kit. You could wear it on horseback. It's got the little lugs on the right-hand side for mounting your lance on it. But this guy, 1580s, he's not going to be in the front ranks with a pike. He's going to be near the back telling the dudes with the pikes what to do. But he still doesn't want to get hit by a random ball or a crossbow bolt or an arrow or, somebody, winding up a swing too far and hitting him, swinging behind his back. So he's still going to wear armor. Yeah. But it also helps to identify if that guy's the one in charge.
I was going to say, there's a command and control thing here. there's a prestige thing here. There's also at the sort of the very far end of this is if I am pinned to the ground with like 6 guys with pikes, this is the armor that says I am worth more to you alive.
than dead. Yeah,
there's like 70,000 guys at the front with no armor whatsoever, and they're being commanded.
I would like to be ransomed, please.
They're being commanded by Darth Vader, like way in the back.
Yeah. Although I'm not entirely sure how the whole ransom system worked out by 1580. I mean, he still wouldn't be killed, but he'd be kept alive. But I don't know if the ransom economy, it really was that, lasted that long. But still,
you just got kidnapped every once in a while. It was fine.
Rich people were still worth money. Yeah.
So your man at arms on the left, he has a lot of leather and a lot of cloth apart from the metal too.
And there's the what's at work here is the issue of building large pieces of continuous steel or iron, such as it is. And it's an easy rule of thumb that the earlier in the period, like post-Roman up to 1600s, the bits of metal you can make for armor get bigger, so that you go from little wee bits of mail linked together, like the mail that's off of his helmet. So you get chain mail, which is pretty effective against cuts, but not so effective against blunt force trauma. It'll just, stop you from getting cut. And then it'll give you a neat bruise pattern from all of the rings getting dug into your arm. And then you've got the body armor, which is this leather kind of poncho with steel plates riveted to the inside. So it's somewhat flexible. So you get cut protection.
Modern tactical guy being like, steel plates, they don't do shit. You need ceramic in there.
Actually, this is the funny thing. Okay, I think it's funny. Steel, this stuff works great against sharp force and blunt force trauma, like weapons, swords and axes and stuff. This is exactly what you want. If you wail on a guy with an axe who's wearing ceramic body armor, you're going to break all ceramic body armor.
There you go.
But because that's exactly what ceramic body armor is supposed to do when it gets hit by bullets.
Yeah.
It breaks and it sucks up all the energy, but it's usually only going to get hit once. Other types of tactical body armor, like the Kevlar stuff, the layered sort of stuff, again, same kind of thing. It's trying to suck out the energy from one very small point of contact, not from a big and continuous point of contact like a blade edge. So Kevlar can still protect you from stabs, but it doesn't protect you from getting like wailed on by a baseball bat. The helmets are pretty good, but yeah. So steel works well in this respect, but it's not impervious. There are trade-offs. You still need to be able to move. You still need to be able to see, and you can't always afford to protect everything that you should protect, particularly the face, because you're cutting into visibility. But yeah,
at this point, like, steel's really hard to make too, right?
Steel specifically, yeah. I mean, this stuff's going to be iron. It's less ductile than your steel, so this is why when people see illustrations in the battle scenes in your illustrated Bible where there's guys burying their sword into a helmeted head, and you go, "Oh, this is just this is ridiculous." Did anyone believe this? Well, and this is the complaint I have with a lot of the YouTube stuff where people say, "Oh, look, we're going to use this sword against this helmet." Say, hold on. Is that helmet made out of forged iron? Or is it steel? It's always steel. Steel deforms. It's ductile. A forged iron helmet will crack if you hit it the right way and you hit it hard enough.
Like boiling on a big Le Creuset sort of pot or something.
Yeah. So you put an iron kettle hat on some target and you hit that with an accurate sword, you may actually get the effect you see in the illustrations for some Bible in the battlefield, is your sword getting stuck in the gap that opened up in this guy's helmet because you hit it and it just split open. That's the big difference. And I've yet to see someone do a cut test on an iron helmet for obvious reasons. But anyway,
what amuses me is this guy's kettle helmet. This guy's is it a sallet or is that something else?
No, that is a kettle helmet or a chape de fer, depending on who you look at.
What strikes me about it is that it's my guy is better protected against both shrapnel and like anything sort of any trauma directed downwards, then like most soldiers in the 20th century until towards the middle of the First World War. Yeah. It's something that we had to reinvent this anew, which is so weird.
Well, I mean, they do have parabolic sort of projectiles at this period, so there is an obvious advantage or incentive to have protection for that, even if you're not going to be mucking it out with guys with swords swinging at you. But you do want some protection from projectiles, which are going to be coming at an arc over at you rather than straight line. Once you start fighting in trenches, where the only part that's visible is your head, and they're throwing a lot of artillery at you, then you start thinking, oh, hey, maybe we should go back to that whole steel cap thing.
Sort of like pseudo-medieval aspect of the First World War or something that interests me a lot. But
the thing that's getting me is how shiny all this stuff is. Like, it looks like he went to the Bud Company and got some stainless steel armor.
But don't break.
But don't break, I
think the odds are pretty good that stuff is steel. It probably isn't stainless. Stainless is a motherfucker to work cold. Nobody likes doing it. So it's probably steel. But then you oil it and things like that. And you do want to keep the stuff clean, even from, a medieval point of view.
Right.
If you've ever been, wearing a steel helmet that's rusty on the inside and somebody wails on you, it's not fun getting a bunch of, red, mist that isn't your own blood in your eyes. That's no fun. Yeah. It's like, oh, I'm tasting metal. Did I get cut? No, it's just the rust from the inside of your hat.
No, I'm going to get tetanus, though.
Yeah. And they can fix a lot of stuff at this time, but they can't fix tetanus.
Next slide.
Okay. Oh, yeah, this is more.
Oh, this is yours, yes.
Okay, this is a little digression about, which was prompted by a large lad with his Disney armor.
There's a door. There's a sally port.
So
don't like it as a sally port. I'll be dumping piss on you from a murder hole.
You don't want to mess with the hard men at arms at the pub. No, you let them do their thing. You stand out of the way. You ask them for a light, maybe. That's it.
So far in medieval conflict, I think I'm going to be manning the murder hole. That sounds like sounds like a pretty good one.
I'm not going to do so good here.
Yeah. So this is a little digression on back to some of the osteoarchaeology. So now what was the date? I'm going to forget my dates. Where was... Yeah, I'm a historian who can't remember dates. Sue me. Yes, 22nd of July, 1361.
Uh-oh.
You can't do... That's the earliest date we've ever had deployed on the show like this.
Oh, I got it for this one. Small.
I still want to do an ancient Roman disaster at some point.
Vesuvius, so small detachment of Danes land on the Swedish island of Gotland and make their way towards town of Visby. It's a little walled town. I don't remember why they're there or what their purpose was, but it was combative. And the local forces came out, met the Danes outside the city wall because they didn't want to fight them in the city, because that would just be bad for the city's sake. There was a little scrap. The Geats lost. The Danes did whatever they needed to do with Visby, and then they moved on. There were around 1,500 fatalities amongst the town defenders.
Jesus.
The people who survived fled the town because they were worried the Danes were going to just burn the place, because that often is how this works. And they didn't come back to deal with the aftermath for about 3 days. And this is in the middle of July. So 1,500 or so bodies are left out in the open for about 3 days. This is now a massive emergency to bury them as fast as possible. So they dig 3 big pits and they huck everybody in. And then they dig a 4th one that's a little bit cleaner a little while later. And the people who've died in the 3 days since get put a little more orderly in there. And they cover it all up and they forget about it. They put a cross up there to commemorate it. And in 1903, somebody who's been doing, I think, a road widening finds one of the mass graves. And over the next 30 years, about 1,100 skeletons are excavated. Amongst those skeletons are a little over 24 sets of body armor.
Because you're not prying this stuff back off of a guy who smells that bad.
Well, yeah. Some of this stuff was found on individuals, although the archaeologists doing this at the time didn't know how to deal with finds this big, and they didn't recover individuals as complete individuals. So while we've got photos of some guys in armor, like the skeleton still in the body armor, we don't know what killed those particular wearers, which is infuriating, but it's what it is. And there was some body armor that was just thrown in on its own. It was just too filthy, presumably. And there were over 100 sets of the male, the little male balaclavas. We have a skull still stuck in one in the top left.
Yeah, that's a really haunting image there.
There's a bunch like that. I picked the least alarming one, actually. And yeah, it is almost completely mineralized. There's not much steel left or iron left in the rings. There's just these big rust kind of things.
I love when we talk about like happy, positive things in the podcast.
Does it make you feel better to know that Europe is built on like a sort of 12-foot deep lair of these guys?
Guys, yeah.
Welcome to my entire career.
Some Danes killed 1,500 Swedes, basically the same people.
Yeah. We took the L there, unfortunately.
Could well all have been Christians.
I mean, it was Christians fighting Christians. I mean, it's 1350s.
Y'all fucking love to do it, don't you?
Yeah.
We don't know what they were fighting over, and they probably didn't either.
This isn't my problem anymore.
So while they did find some body armor, they didn't find really much of anything else. There were a few gauntlets. There was, I think, a pocket knife, basically. There were some arrowheads, but no helmets, no arm defenses, no leg defenses. I think it was like part of an arm defense. That's it. All of that stuff, whatever was present, was salvaged. The rest of the stuff was ditched. So even with something like this, we still don't know how many people wore helmets, how effective they were, all that sort of stuff. So again, this is another one of the, hey, look at all the stuff we found. Hey, look at how inconclusive the results are from it. So welcome again to the vast world of ambiguity, which is history.
The past is a foreign country, as they say.
It's like
they do things differently there.
Yeah, and when the past is a foreign country, and then you're also in a foreign country like Sweden, then it's two foreign countries at once, which makes it much more confusing.
Whoa, what are the immigration laws like there? Bet they're still pretty racist.
It's like it's like
don't worry, we haven't gotten any better as a species.
The image of the bomber where it got shot,
Oh yeah. The survivor bias. Yeah.
The guy's got on Twitter with body armor.
Yeah,
it's good. It's good. Yeah,
it's always a
good one. I will say, the museum actually in Stockholm that still has some of the skeletons from this is very nice and let me come and see their teaching collection using my very dodgy tractor museum credentials. I don't know how much I learned, but I did get a really nice Facebook profile photo for my effort there. So,
hi, can I touch the bones?
I'm a doctor, please. Let me touch the bones.
I've always wondered if we could get into stuff claiming we were press.
Yeah.
This is a form of journalism.
Let me touch the skulls. I'm a podcaster. It's an emergency.
Podcaster. It's like Penn Museum of Anthropology. I want to see the dead move children.
They started giving them back, dude.
Man.
They started giving them back.
They gave them back.
So great.
That's a podcast topic for you guys again.
Yeah,
too.
no, fully.
Oh yeah, it gives us lots of time to shit on Penn, the worst university on God's green earth.
I mean, the move bombing in general is that's a subject right there.
Yeah.
Oh, we should do the move bombing.
We got one last slide on armor here.
Yeah, welcome to There's Your Problem, where we plan the next episode live on the air.
Okay. Yeah, this was another one I put in. This sort of goes back to the question about armor and its function. And, we all anticipate that armor protects you by intervening between harmful intent and your squishy bag of meat. There is an underappreciated aspect of this, which sort of only comes back again in the post 1600s with the Earl of Pembroke's armor, where it's really flashy and it shows that this guy's worth a lot of money, so you probably shouldn't kill him. In the 5th, 6th, 7th century, I argue that was really the golden age of really showy armor that you actually wore in combat, because while it could protect you from direct harm, it did a much better job of communicating to everybody else that you were someone you didn't want to mess with. Because if you go out into a battlefield wearing this helmet, this being a reconstruction of the helmet parts found at Staffordshire in 2008, you're probably related to some kind of deity. You might have killed a dragon at some point, maybe. I don't know. This seems familiar.
Yeah, that's a question I was about to get into. Is like, to what extent can we imagine that like wearers of this take it as a form of spiritual, religious, magical protection, even?
Well, that's certainly how early archaeologists interpreted these sorts of finds. I mean, the helmets at Valsgard and Vendel, very similar to these. These are Swedish finds. Helmets from the 5th and 6th century, which look superficially like Roman cavalry armor, and they're covered in little sort of warrior figures and what look like ceremonial things, but they could also be little stories from actual events or familiar events. One recurring motif on a lot of these helmets is an armed rider running down footmen. And that's actually a motif that shows up on a Roman cavalryman's tombstone. It's sort of like a visual language that martial culture understood. So they just kept
sort of like an end
it.
zone dance. After the infantry battle is over and all the smartest ones have dropped their shields and started running, here's where I come in.
I'm here to hit the gritty, baby.
It's Minecraft enchanted diamond armor.
and this guy wouldn't have fought on horseback. Actually, none of them would have in 6th and 7th century Old English period. They were all foot combat, but they knew what heroes looked like. Heroes fight on horseback. They wear helmets made of gold with big crests and stuff. And you see this guy surrounded by a dozen slightly less ostentatiously equipped people, and then a whole bunch of people who look like you and your neighbor who live in a sod hut someplace. And you go out, and this is more gold than you've ever seen in your life. It's very easy to think, we probably shouldn't get near this guy. But, we can fight the other people, let the other people with the gold helmets on our side fight the gold helmets on their side, and let's just cross our fingers and hope we go home alive. So in this way, armor is working entirely on the attitude of the potential attacker, not as conventional armor being just working when it protects you from being hit.
What would now be called psyops, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it's nothing new under the sun yet again. But
yeah, I had another question, which is like, I guess it's not even a question. It's like how it's purely a guess. How much can we imagine of sort of decoration and armor like existed and just doesn't survive? Stuff that's like,
well, the large lad back there with his gear, that stuff's extremely plain in reproduction, mostly because we don't know if it was decorated or not. There are a handful of surviving helmets from 15th, 16th century on that are painted. So they look otherwise pretty boring as these sort of stripped down things, kind of like the way Roman marble looks. And then you find out that they painted everybody, and oh god. So painting helmets was pretty common. So the odds are pretty good. Paint decoration on equipment, on your body armor, and this sort of stuff was also common. And certainly in the golden age of heraldic representation, you wanted to use this stuff because it helped identify what side you were on, who you were in command by, that sort of stuff. So yes, there is an awful lot of stuff that isn't surviving.
I mean, especially if it's steel armor, you'd want to paint that because it's just lower maintenance then.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's not as good as you can't powder coat it, but you do. So you keep having to touch it up, and you can't just throw it in the bag at the end of the day. That stuff's going to scrape. But
Yeah.
I'd probably throw it in the bag at the end of the day. I'd be pretty tired.
I think about like putting feathers on stuff, for instance, something which dudes love to do. We love to do it.
Yeah.
Bersaglieri still do it to this day. Just tie a feather on your helmet.
Yeah. Well, during the period where you had tournaments, you could show off a lot more there than on Battlefield, because you could put these, those big ornate torsos on your helmet, because you take your helmet out and sit it out around everybody else's, so everybody knew who was fighting that day, that kind of stuff. I mean, that was a real opportunity to show off. But that also had an audience, whereas most battles didn't. Or didn't have an audience that you wanted to impress in that way. Let's put it that way.
To me, just as an aside, and I'll say this before we close out this slide, to me, I think the aesthetically coolest thing is one of the sort of very trad imagination sort of like plate helmets, the very pointy ones, that has a crown on it. Love that.
Oh, yeah,
Cannot get enough of it.
And that isn't like the helmets with crowns on them. That, there's the story of Henry VII being crowned on the battlefield of Bosworth by one of his men finding Richard's crown in a bush and pulling it up. Here you go. There is documentation for crowns worn on helmets in that period. Henry V's will had at least 2 of them, and these were jeweled crowns, possibly made of leather and then covered in gold foil and little semi-precious stones, such that you could just wire it to the top of his bassinet when he went into combat. So in addition to all the heraldry and being surrounded by dukes and things, he also got to wear an actual crown.
Yeah,
so,
I'm not going to sort of make a wild lunge at the guy who is wearing sort of a bunch of rubies and emeralds on his hat.
Unless you're actually Richard III and you're trying to swing at Henry Tudor, which is essentially what he did.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Next slide, please. And this is one that I'm really excited to talk about. Medicine, trauma care, survivability, all of these things.
Isn't this what Mia's podcast is about?
Yeah.
We're just ripping it off at this point. Fuck them.
Oh.
So you're on one bonus episode. You don't get any more.
we see the guy who looks a lot like our sort of wide lad from earlier, having some major surgery done to him. He's about to lose a limb.
This guy is me. This is me. And I don't know who the rest of us are.
The sort of the medieval hat game where it's just like it's a series of cloth shapes is that's a great period in fashion to me.
Yes, I think this is about early 1500s. There's Landsknechts again, or at least Germans.
So I guess my question is, okay, I've been to the battle.
Yeah.
And my medieval PPE has not protected me, and I have become injured in a serious way. How likely am I to die? And if I do die, what am I going to die of?
Right. Okay. I'll remind listeners, of course, that while I am a historian of violence, I'm not a medical historian, but I've seen a lot of bad history about it. So this is going to be my sort of take on this based on my reading and understanding of the material. As far as actual details and specifics, you'll probably want to find somebody else. But in general terms, you have a reasonably good chance of survival, all things considered, so long as you aren't hit, injured seriously internally. So limbs, even the head to some extent, cut injuries, crushing injuries, that sort of stuff. Survivability is reasonable, all things considered. The sort of medical intervention that's available throughout the medieval period isn't really much different than what it was in the 19th century, American Civil War. There's a little bit of fine-tuning here and there, but for the most part, your treatment is more or less the same. It gets weird if you have internal injuries because it's just harder to manage. It's also the part of the body that people didn't understand particularly well. But a lot of the other stuff, a lot of the injuries, treatment is very intuitive. They did understand that the heart pumps blood through the body, and if you cut a vein, you're going to bleed to death. You can't lose too much of that stuff. So you have to, figure out ways of stopping this. So they could suture major bleeds, they could cauterize amputations, they could do other sorts of things like this. They understood that you didn't want to leave foreign bodies in a wound. You get hit by an arrow and they pull the shaft out and they leave the point back in. You got to go in and get the point out. If the point hits you in the torso somewhere, that's going to be harder than if it hits you someplace else. But, as far as the practical management of injuries is concerned, it's not all that bad. Where it sounds bad is when you're dealing with the sort of medical philosophy. So the stuff about humors and the sympathetic relationships between fruits shaped like certain organs. And
I come into the sort of the doctor, the barber surgeon's tent, and my arm is hanging off, and the guy's like, "Hey, you're too wet. We're gonna have to dry you right the fuck out." You
want an Ambrose Paré. You don't want a Galenic scholar. You want a guy who.
So let me get my case of leeches out.
Yeah. So, and there is very much in the material, like this is why we get kind of, there's debate about this, is the literature they produced at the time doesn't, give you much confidence in their ability to handle this. The archaeology, on the other hand, suggests that they were a lot more competent than we give them credit for, again, depending on where you get hit. So what is going to kill you then is still probably going to kill you now. With the possible exception of certain kinds of infections, shock. So just traumatic shock of the injuries. That's a hard thing to handle one way or the other. And then infections. So blood infections caused by foreign bodies, or infections caused by secondary effect of internal injuries. So you get smacked in the head, you're still going to get a concussion. You get whaled in the torso and you rupture a kidney. I can't really do much about that. That's kind of your main, live or die sort of situation. And again, that was still more or less the case into the late 19th century. Guy takes a mini ball to the guts. He's probably just as dead as the guy who takes a crossbow bolt to the guts. Once you get into the nuts and bolts of the internal, torso, once you get into all that confusing stuff, it's remains confusing.
So what we're learning here is to trust the practitioner and not the theorist, then.
Yes, which oddly enough has a parallel with teaching fighting, where it's the theorists don't really talk about it much. The practical ones don't write it down in books. So
the guy who is actually pushing arrowheads through wounds or whatever is not taking the time to have a beautifully sort of illuminated treatise done. Although
we do have one or two accounts of just such a situation on account of the importance of the patient. There's the Henry V, quite notably, and when was that? I've got a date for that one too.
21st of July, 1403.
Thank you. Yes, Battle of Shrewsbury. Young Henry V, he's not Henry V yet, his father's still king. He eats an arrow to the face. Ooh. Probably a crossbow bolt. It probably hits him
a good proletarian weapon there.
Yeah, it hits him just inside of one of his nostrils, passes through his sinus cavity down over the hard palate, and kind of stops against the back of his skull on the opposite side.
So, like getting a COVID test.
It's getting a COVID test, and the tester slips and shoves his arm into you up to his wrist.
New intrusive thought just dropped. I don't want to go to the testing center and the guy's just cranking back a big mechanical crossbow.
So yeah, it gets this. It was probably
a medical professional.
His buddies do the sort of intuitive thing, and they try to pull it out. They get the shaft out, but the point stays inside because it's just a socketed bodkin point, so it's all the way in there. You can't get at it from the other side because his skull is in the way. So this doctor, whose name I will not be able to recall off the top of my head, he's present and he treats the king, and he wrote up the treatment in excruciating detail. Which shows not only
in a sort of like, please do not have me killed for fucking this up sort of way.
Well, he did write it for other medical types, showing that here's the practical way in which you can do this. And it's
the
again,
worst psychos imaginable. Here's all the horrible things we did.
It's funny because in Shakespeare, there's the depiction of Henry V as being this kind of wild child prior to being king, and then when he's king, he's all sober and serious and all of this. And there is some historical evidence for Henry undergoing a kind of a change of personality from his youth to his maturity as king. And I'd argue the experience of this was probably what did it. Because to get the arrow point out of his face, the doctor basically he made a bunch of shims to open up the wound channel large enough that he could then get kind of a screw tool in to get a hold of the arrow point through the socket and then pull it back out.
Oh my God.
No anesthetic.
No, I mean, this is force of will kind of stuff. And he's almost certainly conscious the whole time. There's no reason why he wouldn't remain conscious.
There's not even a bullet to bite.
No,
they haven't invented those yet.
You don't want him doing
hold
that.
His mouth open, yeah.
It's going to mess with his sinuses because he can't breathe through his nose. So they get this thing out, and then of course they have this enormous wound channel that they have to then heal. So over the course of the next I think it's about 3 months, the doctor puts in wadding and changes out the bandages regularly, and he allows it to drain and very slowly withdraws these shims and the little paddings and stuff so that the wound can close up under its own rate. So it probably takes something like 6 months for this to completely heal. All the time, Henry has these, wine and honey-soaked lumps of cotton shoved into his nasal cavities while they're soaking up all of these, fluids and stuff from the body doing its own work in healing. And no one can miss it. It's right in the middle of his face. So, and it certainly did leave a scar. Artists only ever depicted Henry from one side after that point. It probably wasn't as serious, really profoundly disfiguring, but it would have been noticeable. And then, of course, the experience of him going through that would have been unavoidably visible to everybody else. But he fully recovered. He died young, but that was from a completely different set of circumstances that medical intervention couldn't help with. Dysentery was much worse on you than
friend of the show.
Weapon trauma. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just noticed this man in blue has a very large package here.
That's the codpiece.
That's just drooping. It's just folding the fabric. He's not. That's again the beauty of the pod.
He's got that dagger. No, he's got that dagger.
It's anyway.
So we have an example of a very successful, very advanced surgical intervention for the time.
Yeah. So we don't have any good illustrations of Henry V, but we do have this gentleman who we've already met once before. He's referred to in the literature as Towton 16. That was the catalog number they gave his skeleton. It's from that Battle of Towton, the Wars of the Roses battle. Was it Easter Sunday? 1461. Fought in a raging snowstorm in North Yorkshire.
And met a very bloody end.
Yeah. This guy, he was probably in his mid to late 50s. He was a career soldier of some sort, probably of the type who just staffed garrisons on the borders, in the marches or with Scotland. He was trained as a longbowman. He had disproportionate skeletal development in his right arm from pulling the draw weight on a 130-pound bow. And he did that all of his life, so he had this very pronounced asymmetry. He also had asymmetry in the face from this injury. This was probably an axe. It could have been a sword. It's hard to tell. But he was hit in the side of the jaw. The blow knocked some teeth out of the way and passed through his mouth and struck the inside of the other side of his lower jaw and left a nick in the bone. But he survived this by good 10, 15 years. So this was fully healed up, and he was right back in the ranks to be killed in Towton. And they made sure he was dead that time. He's the one who had about
yeah, someone who had like
injuries.
seen him come back from this is like, yeah, okay, not taking any chances with this guy.
Yeah,
I was about to say this man may be unkillable.
Well,
local man is too angry to die.
This is rapidly approaching my theory, which is we'll get to this in the next slide.
He was too mad about the bins.
Yeah, that's right.
So, lest people think that this is just a one-off, and that we're just talking about people getting hit in the less important parts of the face. We do have
important parts of the face.
Yeah.
I mean, they're less important for the functioning of the body, right? I mean,
True.
There's no brain in your sinus cavities, at least at this point.
Right.
So I put at least one image here from another skeleton taken out of, I think it's an English cemetery again, of a very well healed cut wound to the parietal bone right in front of him. So now he probably lost his piano lessons from that one, but it's again completely healed. We've got probably another 10, 15 years of survivability after. Just
in the barber surgeon's tent, like, can I still play the harpsichords?
Yeah.
No.
I mean, I do have a coroner's account of someone who was hit more or less the same way. They removed 13 pieces of bone from the wound. He lost his ability to speak, and they were probably thinking he was going to die, but he survived it, and then ended up suing the guy who attacked him through his wife because he couldn't speak in court. So yeah, and that was 13th century in England. So again, this guy doesn't have the king's doctors to take care of him, but he lucked out, didn't die of any sort of infections, and more or less recovered. So again, it all depends on where you're hit, and if you win the coin toss of infection.
All right. Now I got to talk about a guy I like, a historical guy, as the sort of guy finder general. Next slide, please. Okay, so I got to talk about a German knight, I suppose you would call him, by the name of Götz von Berlichingen.
That's a very silly name.
Yes, very silly name, not a silly guy. He was this sort of like incredibly profane dude who was a very successful fighter, but as a young man, he lost his lower right arm, to a cannonball, I believe, which right through to like the Napoleonic Wars, that's one of the better ways to lose an arm, because the amputations, that's sort of done for you, it's
just clean up after that point.
Yeah, like the impression that you get from reading, I think it is actually a Waterloo thing where Wellington looks over at his staff officer. They've heard the cannonball go past, and Wellington goes, "My God, sir, your arm's off." And the guy looks down and goes, "My God, so it is." So it's just sort of like this, this fait accompli. So he loses the arm, and what he does is he has 2 iron arms made for him, iron hands, I suppose you would say. These like lower arm prosthetics, and this is the second of them. And it has flexible fingers. It can grip. It can grip reins. It can grip a quill, supposedly. And
you still need the other hand to make it do that, but
yes,
we're splitting
still
hairs.
Pretty
on
impressive.
I shouldn't take that away from you, right?
Yeah. And the weird thing about Goethe is that he lives sort of a charmed life. Like, he dies in his 80s. He's at one point, he's like officially reprimanded. He's like outlawed by the Holy Roman Emperor, and he buys his way back in. He's at one point he's head of a peasant rebellion, and he doesn't even get killed. He gets acquitted because he goes to court and he says, "Yeah, I was actually trying to like be a moderate influence on it from the inside."
German states were wild back then.
Yeah, no, 100%. So I wanted to talk about sort of what disability and what disfigurement specifically meant in the context of medieval violence, and then I have a theory to drop on you. Right.
Okay. So again, somewhat like the medical stuff, there's a whole field of study of the place, the social meaning of disability and things like that. in the medieval period. So it's not, I'm far from an expert on it, but with any luck I can do this some justice. It all depends to some extent who you are, again, and who is making the judgments about you as to what disfigurement, disability will mean for you socially. So, so far as the church was concerned, people who were not physically whole were also not kind of spiritually whole. This is one of the rules about whether or not you become, like if you want to become a monk or a priest or someone in major orders, you had to be physically complete. You know, they did a ball check and all this sort of stuff, make sure everything's there. And
Well, you're
It
not
was
gonna use
inspection
it.
day at the monastery.
I know.
I turn to run and the doors are sealed.
But you have to be complete because, you know, if you've, say, taken the shortcut and say, oh, okay, I'm not going to have any inappropriate urges when I'm a priest if I, you know, lack the equipment for it, well, you're cheating. You know, that's not right. Eunuchs are not recognized by God as being good spiritual people, so no. So, and this did extend to, you know, accidental loss of functions or parts. And it could even apply to people who were disfigured in combat, in what was otherwise a sort of morally unimpeachable activity, for the most part, wherever you are. So somebody like Henry V, who has this hideous, for a while, wound to the face and then has a permanently disfiguring injury. By the sort of generally accepted standards at the time, this would also have reflected a disfigurement of Henry's spiritual self. He would have been, you know, a less than perfect person because he was now physically less than perfect. But there's no evidence that that was ever applied to Henry. Probably because the fact that he was king offset any losses he sort of suffered in that respect. That didn't apply, though, to Richard III.
He could have become a James Bond villain.
Oh, yeah. Well, and Richard did. You know, he had...
Yeah.
You know, he and it's funny because after finding his skeleton, it probably wasn't a really obvious issue. He had mild scoliosis. So he would have walked a little bit differently. He would have had a slightly different freedom of movement. He probably had to wear slightly different armor than what everybody else did. He didn't participate in tournaments or stuff like that. But he was unquestionably brave. He was sort of a king's or a soldier's king. But that didn't save him from being a bad guy afterwards and being more of a bad guy because he wasn't quite right physically. So for Götz here to be disfigured in this way doesn't seriously harm his social self because he's already part of kind of an outsider community anyway. You know, he's a soldier for hire. These people are morally ambiguous anyway, so him losing a hand isn't going to be a serious problem to his chances of sort of social success. But yeah, otherwise there is a very overt prejudice against physical disability and these sorts of things within most contexts. Now, it also can get sort of sacralized, lepers being special examples of it. These are people who are suffering a punishment from God, and showing compassion to lepers is good for your soul.
Yeah,
and is good for
the
them.
one specific thing that Jesus is said to have done.
Yeah.
The one kind of disability that he treats that's the one we're going to care about, sort of.
Yeah. So yeah, it's again, this is just a quick overview of my perspective on it, but it is context specific. So if you're special enough, you can avoid the social prejudice against these kinds of things, but it's not a common experience.
So I'm gonna deploy the theory at this point. I'm gonna unpack the theory, which is Götz interests me as an example of what you might call like a man of violence, right? We talked a little bit about this earlier, that like most people at this time, or really at any time, do not go to war. And if they go to war, most people who go to war don't fight. You guard the big grain store or something, or in a
you
modern
sit in a
context
castle for a couple of years.
Yeah, in a modern context, you check the tire pressure on a bunch of Humvees.
Hanging out here with the ballista.
Yeah,
we have
exactly.
one of them. We don't know how it works.
That's the job that you want to do. Yeah. But so we're talking about a minority of a minority of a minority who actually, what you would now describe as, I suppose, a combat veteran, right? And of those people, you can divide them up even further, and you can go, okay, some of them are gonna drop their shields and run. Some of them are gonna get killed. But some of them won't. Some of them will come through the other side and will have participated in combat. And of those, most of them, some of them are going to be like grievously troubled by it emotionally. Some of them outwardly aren't and are just going to come home and like never think about it again and just be like, well, that was a time in my life. Now I'm doing something else. But it's always struck me that there is this small proportion, and I think it is a small proportion, who experience that kind of combat and love it. They love it and they don't ever want to do anything else. And this has been sort of this like abiding feature of like the history of combat, of war. It's like, from warlords to mercenaries from that day to this and I can't really defend this, but I think that the modern doctrine of special forces is an attempt to find these guys and like pull them out of the population and use them to do the nasty things.
I do feel like the modern American military is devoted to creating a military that's entirely those guys.
I don't think it is. I think it's important to keep them as a minority who you can use for the dirty jobs. But what's awkward to me is that these guys, they recur across seemingly all cultures, all classes. Gertz was born quite aristocratic, but like others might not be. Like to a man, even including like the ones who get hacked apart, like Mr. Talton 16, they tend to do pretty well out of it. Like they have a way of doing well out of times of crisis and of war, but also out of peacetime.
Yeah.
And it's very strange because some of them are fun to read about, like Gertz or Bob Dinard or Adrian Carton de Wier, the guy who like got shot twice in the face and said, on the whole, I enjoyed the war. Some of them aren't fun to read about, like Otto Skorzeny or Nathan Bedford Forrest, but they're useful. You need these guys because everyone else doesn't want to be there. And I think.
So I gave little qualifications for the last two comments about medicine and disability. I don't have to give one for this one because this is actually my backyard of violence. The theory. The theory holds. I mean, now, what makes these people? How you get the sort of recurring group that, for whatever reason, I mean, we can understand why someone wants to fight for their country or serve and, this kind of stuff. It's another, that's one thing. The hard thing is to understand the people who genuinely enjoy it.
Yeah.
And there are ample examples of this where you don't have to think, this person's just making, they're just painting this as they're compensating. They're trying to rationalize this experience to themselves. Like, no, they genuinely enjoy this. There are a handful of examples of people speaking with that degree of sort of self-awareness and honesty from the medieval period, although it's often not read with the same meaning. So you get, and I'm not going to remember his name, but there was a French troubadour from the 14th century who was writing about how happy he was that campaign season was coming back, and that soon
football season is back.
Yeah, he'd be out, and we'd be riding through the fields, and there'd be banners waving, and there'd be people screaming, and there'd be bodies falling into the river, and a taste of blood, spitting out teeth. I mean, I miss it. And you have sociologists like Norbert Elias reading this and saying, what is wrong with these people? They were psychotic children with swords, or this has to be parody. You can't honestly believe this. And then you read, there's an account from he was often an SS guy, Second World War, and he's been disarmed by the Soviets, and he's sitting around and he's looking at the other guys. It's like, oh, the war's over. What are we possibly going to do? I felt so much better when I was getting shot at and killing people.
Go become Swiss or Belgian and like join the French Foreign Legion and lose again in Vietnam.
The Stahlhelm movement, post First World War, where the guys are talking about, it's like, oh yeah, the war's not over. It's never over. We're the war. As long as we're alive, the war still keeps going. We're going to invade Poland. I mean, this is
the Rick and Morty contract killer.
Now, with some of this, it's easy to make modern analogies with our historical examples because we have examples of it now. The problem comes from the basis on which those attitudes are founded. So there is some discussion as to whether or not post-traumatic stress disorder, at least as a consequence of experiencing combat, is a modern thing or if it has a historical analog. There's a guy named Jay who's written 2 books showing how you can read both the Odyssey and the Iliad as manifestations of or parallels of the experiences of Americans coming back from Vietnam. The parallels are so obvious; it's hard to believe that
Achilles
Homer
stays in his tent and doesn't come out and speak to anyone.
Yeah. I mean, there's survivor guilt in this stuff. You can find examples of it in Shakespeare, where there's a degree of authenticity that he's writing characters based on people who have survived these sorts of things, and it's affected how they see the world. Now, the big difference is that the sort of stuff that gives people a framework to understand the world in the medieval period is different from what it is now. And one of the biggest differences is that the church, in certain circumstances, says God is happy with you killing people in these circumstances. So you should feel
convenient.
So you should feel no guilt whatsoever about this. And in fact, avoiding these sorts of conflicts or withholding your skill in arms from the services of the church is wrong. So to avoid this stuff is wrong. You should go and do this. So that kind of changes the value of the experience. And it's something we don't quite have now, unless you find some other kind of basis in which to build that rationalization, which you can get out of things like nationalism or group solidarity or racism or white supremacist world conquering. It's usually not a good thing.
The group thing interests me as well because I've been reading about I've been reading Antonio Scarlatti. I've been dragging myself through Antonio Scarlatti's fictive biography of Mussolini called M, Son of the Century. It's really good. Little Alice book recommendation there. But it's largely about sort of the early days of Italian fascism. And how much it was sort of an outgrowth specifically of the assault battalions, the Arditi, in German service, the Stostrup, and the guys who did your Hutia tactics, your early sort of fire and maneuver stuff, and got overwhelmingly killed. And the survivors, however brutalized, came back and go, okay, well, as you say, we are the war.
Yeah.
There's a line in a I think it might even have been Mussolini's newspaper. With a very sort of deliberately provocative editorial. And the line that stuck with me is, if you fought in the war, if you were for the war and you fought in it and you didn't fight in these specific units, you didn't fight. And that kind of sense of identity, I think about that, and I think about the sort of overgrown special forces community that we currently have, and I just sort of laugh nervously to myself.
I mean, there's the free companies from the 100 Years' War. These guys who basically became mercenaries, and if no one was paying them to fight, they just fought on their own. They'd take over some town, they'd fortify it. One of the biggest English commanders of those, who made a name and a career for himself in Italy, actually. Hawkwood, John Hawkwood.
Oh, John Hawkwood, with the White Company.
Hawkwood,
yes.
Yep.
He's quoted as saying at some point, it may be apocryphal, but it's something along the lines of, peace is the death of me. And a lot of people read that and think, oh, he just, if there's peace declared, he's out of a business. Now, at that point in his career, he was titled, he owned land in a lot of places, never visited it because he was always on campaign. But I think more accurately, what he's saying is, this is the death of me as a social thing. If I'm not out fighting, if I'm not out doing my violence on whatever I feel like, then I'm not me anymore. Peace gives me no purpose. So I will make war in order to give myself function. You actually see this percolate down into sort of individual conflicts within, just local communities. I went through 15th century Court of King's Bench English criminal material looking for militarized interpersonal violence. So people fighting each other in some town square where they've gone and gotten their friends and they put all their armor on and they've gone out to do it in public. Like, they're not breaking into somebody's house at 2 a.m. and beating them up and taking away stuff. They're walking out in broad daylight wearing armor to settle these scores with the intention that aspect of the performance, doing this like you're in an army, like this is an act of war, gives it legitimacy. And to some extent, the court accepted it. Now, they never spelled it out that way, but people who busted into someone's house at 2 a.m. and fled after murdering someone were treated much more harshly by the courts than 18 guys who show up at sundown, drag a guy out of his house and kill him and walk off. It's
an interesting parallel to your modern 3%er donning their plate carrier or whatever.
Yeah. Well, although thankfully in the modern example, the court isn't going to treat you any better.
Yeah.
But it's because there was so little difference between the sort of rationale for an international war. I mean, started the 100 Years' War is Edward III's sort of legal claim on the crown of France. Someone who has their own land dispute can use, it's really easy to rationalize the same sort of behavior. As you get further away from this period, those opportunities diminish, of course, quite rapidly, and you're left with just, these sort of state-sanctioned events that you can participate in. And that will attract certain people who want to participate in that. And like you said, wars benefit from these people. You want people with a diminished sense of self-preservation to do this. And if they enjoy doing it, all the better, because then they incentivize themselves. You don't have to pay them. You don't have to say, oh, we're going to give you promotions, stuff like this. It's like, no, we're going to give you freedom of action. We're going to give you your own little man, and you go off and just achieve whatever sort of military objectives we set for you, and how you get there, we don't care.
Yeah.
That's
just be yourself and have fun with it.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm just a small bean who has anxiety.
Just don't
put a 6-pound gun right in someone's fucking face.
Yeah. Just don't expect us to, make you a major public figure afterwards. We're quite prepared to completely disown you and kick you.
Dusting my hands of this. Don't have to worry about it ever again. Next slide, please.
So here's my question. I just fought in a battle, which I don't understand why I fought in it. 45,000 people were killed to defend a town 45 miles north of Lyon, maybe, right? I stabbed 17 14-year-olds in the eye.
Oh, congratulations, Ross.
I myself am 15. I come back from the battle and I was like, this seems like a stupid thing. I think we should be anti-war. Were there peaceniks at all?
Yeah. It's now most of the people who were sort of anti-war were, religious theorists, things like this. The problem, though, is that most of the anti-war talk is war is bad unless we get
about to kill Christians.
It's what is it, Augustus? Augustine. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just saying, I was answering Alice's question. Is it bad to kill Christians? Or saying, just is it? I mean, that's. I don't think it is.
Yeah. See, there's this argument. You look at Augustine or these major church fathers who talk about, Christians shouldn't be killing each other. These sort of wars for private gain over territory, one king fighting the other. These are all wrong. But if the Pope needs you to go and fight someplace, including other Christians if they're bad Christians, you should. There's nothing in the Bible so far.
Cathar shit.
The Bible says you have to fight Russians.
Get in there, hotshot.
Yeah, there's one of the sort of fatal flaws to any sort of genuine pacifist movement in the period is that there's no religious support for it. Really, I mean, I'm generalizing. You may get somebody in the comments telling me I'm a horrible biblical scholar, but I'm not. So
we will never listen to a commenter.
No.
Yeah,
no, we don't.
I'm probably not going to read any of the comments myself. Especially knowing that this is technically the largest audience I've ever reached with a single talk. So anyway, but yes, I should. Oh no, I've lost my train of thought with this. But actually, I'll back up. One of the things you probably won't have to deal with if you're the person who went and killed, a bunch of teens at some battle and went home and thought, gee, this is silly. The entire community, though, would be around you going, hey, Roz has now survived combat. He is now special. Yes. He is now, a veteran. Did you hear he killed a bunch of teens? Being successful in combat.
He gets a 10% off discount at Lowe's for the rest of his life.
It's a mark of moral success.
I can be a blacksmith now.
There's this concept. Richard Kuiper is a historian from Rochester, coined this term. It's the worship of the goddess prowess. If you are good at this, it will forgive a lot of other failings. So again, Henry V, he's got a big crater in his face from an arrow, but he's Henry V. He's defeating France. He's doing all of these spectacular things. Therefore, that compensates. You can have knights and other landed people from this period, genuinely horrible people, but they're profoundly good at fighting. And within that community who worship prowess, that elevates that person to a higher moral value. So no matter how bad you feel about it, your community probably thinks you're still great.
Yeah, and you're going to be a victim of peer pressure. You're going to start thinking that you're great too.
Yeah, your mother is going to tell you not to come back without killing half a dozen teens.
Yeah. And when your son becomes a teen, you're going to go, of course you're going to hate it, but go and do it anyway.
Yeah,
it'll be the making
I would have all kinds of PTSD from that.
Yeah, the question actually about whether or not I think it's often posed as did Crusaders have PTSD? That is actually something that's worth exploring at some point, and I'd be very surprised if anyone could put together an argument that anyone would believe that says no, they didn't. It just would have been different, and they would have thought of it differently. Certainly, depression is documentable. Period.
Men were stronger back then.
I think
men didn't write about their problems as much back then. That's actually the bigger thing.
Yeah, because they didn't know how to write.
Making a sort of compelling argument that it's entirely taking them at their own word with no historical paradigm attached to it whatsoever. That's like, no, they weren't sad. They saw the Virgin Mary as what happened.
Yeah.
All right. Next slide. 7th inning stretch.
All right. I gotta cut down the digressions.
No, not at all. I'm enjoying them.
We did kind of cover. Oh yeah,
it's been a nice episode so far.
So we're I want to talk about where stuff went from here, from the Middle Ages. How did the use of weapons change? And how do you get from like Gertz von Berlichingen like hacking people apart to Caravaggio stabbing a guy to death in a duel over a woman on a tennis court in the back streets of Florence, kind of thing?
Yeah.
Yes.
How does the Renaissance happen?
Yes. How Renaissance?
Well, it shouldn't have happened.
Yeah. How did the Earth's greatest mistake happen?
Well, it happened earlier in Italy. Two theories, one of which is very well known, which explains the whole military thing. The other one is mine, and so you get to hear it. The first one is what's referred to as the early modern military revolution, which wasn't exactly a revolution if it took 300 years, but basically you have around the 1500s, a shift in the way wars are fought, which is a complex interaction of economics making for much larger armies, organization having to change because your armies are a lot larger, and the wider adoption of gunpowder weapons and other types of weapon systems that don't have peacetime analogs. So 12-foot Swiss spears, Swiss pikes used in blocks, you kind of only can do that on a battlefield. So you need to train people to do that specifically, and you're going to be doing that in a formal way. So you have drills, you have parade grounds, you have all this sort of stuff. Same things with simple firearms.
We invented marching up and down the square.
Kind of. And depending on who you talk to, that's responsible for everything about warfare. And that prior to that, no one could think in 3 dimensions and everybody fought in straight lines. Or no one understood how to deploy armies until they figured out how to draw top-down view maps.
Yeah, sort of like Rome, nothing happened.
Yeah,
Like Rome, ancient China, stuff happens. We reinvent drill, and then we turn the lights back on. Harold Kleinschmidt, who figures no one knew how to fight because they couldn't illustrate fight texts in 3 dimensions. Like, well, historians of the senses, I mean, this is what you get. It's early stuff. I shouldn't blame them for being wrong.
Never quite figured it out. They didn't have Blender yet.
We do not have the polygons to be able to fight in this way.
Well, they hadn't invented putting your offhand up like our guy on the right has, which was what makes it fighting.
Now, the thing with the other theory, which is mine, is what I refer to as the gentrification of martial culture.
Fucking hipsters.
So beforehand, well, actually, it's more like the middle class and the expansion of armies, is you need a bunch of people who know how to order people around, how to command groups, but they don't need to actually know how to fight very well themselves. So this undermines the social value of individual skill. So your guy on horseback, your Earl of Pembroke, he doesn't really need to know how to fight anymore. He does need to know how to command people to fight. He does need to know how to organize things, how to convince people to pay his wages, how to logistics and all this sort of stuff. But as an individual combatant,
officers, we invent managers of combat.
Yes. Yeah, these are the military professionals, the sort of new ones. Before that, pretty much anybody who's in a position of authority also had special privileges to violence. These were violence specialists. You now have command specialists, and then you have a bunch of other people who don't really need to be good at fighting, but then you need an enormous number of middle management to sort of have the two groups talk to each other. And it's that
goddamn PMC ruins everything, man.
PMC in both senses at this point.
It's the middle management, the gentry, that start changing how people sort of display knowledge and awareness of personal skill in arms. And since combat weapons aren't the kind of thing you carry around, day to day anymore, you start getting weapons that are designed more specifically for non-combat use. So the rapier, the épée, have dozens of different names for these things. There's what's his name? Gargantuan Pantagruel, Rabelais. He's got a comedic bit where he lists off all of these different names for swords. They're not just swords, but there's like 15 different names. It's like, but the point is that these are swords not used for combat. They're, and then along with that, you get changes in fashion, and then you get sword instructors. You have classes. So you get a bunch of young men who are part of these social groups, and they go and they get taught how to fight just enough to get them into trouble. And then they go out and they get into trouble because
we've taught you how to kill.
Yeah,
nothing
and
else.
Now we need to show off that you're part of this group that takes their public respect seriously, and so you wait until someone gives you the lie, and then you call them out, and then you and your seconds go to Hyde Park, and you chop each other to pieces, and you both die 2 days later. Ad nauseum. or you're lucky and you're French and you get a pardon because they had so much of that there. It's much more well documented in the French period than in English, but that is basically it. So you have a shift in the group of people who are participating in martial culture, and you have a shift in the equipment that's used, which produces this weird splitting off of the two groups. You get the ones at the top who become command. They're the guys who wear the gold-plated armor like Pembroke. And then you get this other group that sort of preserves some of the medieval swordsman ethos, but they're not so important militarily. They're somewhat less status socially, but they're also very insecure. They're very sensitive about their status. And so there's greater opportunity for conflict. And, you can't... this becomes essentially a process where you are always going to lose respect or social status if you're not prepared to defend it. And that could lead to these sort of inevitable cascade effects of violence. So that's the big difference. So prior to this period, you don't actually have people of this same social group fighting each other all the time. It's actually really uncommon. It's only later on where you have this, and then you have a much higher death rate because nobody knows how to do it. Whereas previously, if you had people in the status who did want to fight each other, they knew how to do it in a way that wouldn't likely result in either of their deaths.
We have a tournament, right? Or you have jousting.
Well, yeah. Or you go and fight for a couple of hours until you get tired and you take a break, and then you fight some more, and maybe a couple guys get killed. I mean, it's Battle of 30
let's go out in the field and wrestle kind of thing. Yeah.
Kind of, yep.
I like the bit. I like the bit in the notes here that says, men are trained to kill each other, but not to defend themselves. It reminds me of Catch-22, where Yossarian says, anyone who's trying to kill you is the enemy.
Yeah.
Which I guess included you at this point, yourself.
Yes, it's yourself. Yeah,
having murdered a bunch of 14-year-olds.
Yeah.
Yes,
but so,
I do that daily.
So even this too passes
deserve
into
to
history, as all things must. The fever dream sort of breaks, and now we end up at the next slide with a point where the managerial profession, your officer class, develops to a point of total bifurcation. Mm-hmm. At about the same time that we also stop using swords for serious military purposes.
I will never respect a teenager.
What about a teenager with a halberd?
I will never respect. I will not respect.
It all depends. If the halberd knows what he's doing.
It's a flowchart. Is this teen Swiss? If so, I will not fuck with him. So
I will fuck with him, but I will not respect him.
Yeah. So here we have the modern British Army. This is Sandhurst's swords, where the sword is now it's a saber design, but it's straight. It's very heavily engraved. Yeah. Having seen these, having handled these, you would have a hell of a job putting an edge on it in any meaningful sense.
Yeah.
It's purely a badge of office, and it along with the mess bills, it's a useless expense for junior officers.
Yeah. We probably only also wear them twice a year too. So
yes,
yeah. Now, if you get a doctorate in Finland, they give you a sword, so you don't actually have to pay for it. There is a weird parallel between some 16th century academics who claimed that the doctorate was the equivalent of being a knight because of your trials, like the public disputation and stuff. But he didn't get very far with it. Nobody gave me a sword when I.
Yeah, you're kind of a samurai of academia.
Yeah, right. Oxford's kind of cheap out that way.
Does Eero Saarinen have a sword? Does Alil Saarinen have a sword? I want to know.
Must know.
I don't know if they have doctorates. I mean,
so list of architects ranked by number of swords owned.
List of Finnish architects. I already listed all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Relevant ones, at least.
Actually, I think one of the reasons why sort of the fascination with swords endures as long as it does is because it continues to show up in places like this. It's that somehow there seems to be this a sense of its enduring currency, but of course it isn't. I mean, and then of course it doesn't help with some of the little anecdotes I mentioned in the notes here. But you get what was that? I think there's at least 2 stories about a Russian officer fighting a Japanese officer in the Russo-Japanese War, and then a similar one in the First World War with a German officer. But these are really standout. Like no one is being trained, or no one is expecting to do this. It's sort of, this is as uncommon, well, actually, it's probably far more common to have 2 guys fighting each other with entrenching tools than with swords.
Yeah, sure.
And I mean, practically that has more value. I've seen photos of German soldiers with the shovel taken out of the little holder and then tucked into the front of their belt as like really crude body armor, like just in case. It also makes it easier to grab it if you need to dig. So yeah, but still you see them. And so you, somewhere in the back of your head, you think, oh, swords are still a thing. And in the purely ceremonial sense, they are. But
it has like a traditional role, yeah. I mean, I will point out, still last longer than anyone expected them to. I mean, I know we said we aren't going to talk about Japan and katanas, but the Japanese army was still issuing combat swords for combat till the end of the war.
And the Japanese, I mean, did still train them to be able to do it. Also with bayonets. Bayonets are still a thing. Most rifles are still... I don't know.
You never know when you're going to need one, man.
Well, so I think of that as sort of an analog to the pike, especially it's a very long, like World War I German bayonet. Where it is.
It's been a long time since the police have mounted bayonets, though. I mean, that's one thing they don't do anymore because they could shoot you.
And the knife at the end of a rifle
shoot you and your dog
is much easier to see as a threat than the more abstract. There's a bullet in the rifle too. There is anecdotal stuff from Iraq, like 2003 of people being poked around with the bayonets in the ends of your M4s and clearly responding more respectfully to commands when the rifle had a bayonet on it than when it didn't. So there's still a psychological thing going on. Yeah.
I will point out that in what used to be, what is now the rifles in the British Army, the command to fix bayonets has always been expressed as fix swords. So...
Well, there were sword bayonets at one point.
Yeah.
They're just about as long.
I will also point out that the Royal Navy's last boarding action with a cutlass.
Right.
I should say most recent rather than last because hope springs eternal. But the most recent one was in 1940 off of Norway. So we may yet see occasional uses of the military sword, but I've rounded this out with one final slide, which I put together as a sort of collage for the modern swordsman or woman.
Is this fucking Ben Shapiro?
Yes.
And I wish I knew what, because that isn't even that isn't a katana. That's the big battlefield type that like Toshiro Mifune had in Seven Samurai. I can't remember what those are called.
Is it a dai katana?
Maybe. There's certainly, you can't hide that under your duster at a street fair. So, I don't know.
Yeah. So my thing here is essentially we have buried the sword, right? It's no longer useful. We have turned it into that plowshare finally. Or have we? What of the sword guy with capital letters? Who is a real guy, or I suppose I should say multiple guys. There's a lot of different kinds of guy you can be with a sword.
Yeah, sword people, sword persons,
sword guys,
beings. This one's a tricky one to talk about because, of course, to some extent, the demographic who might be interested in the stuff I talk about also often overlaps with this one. And full disclosure, I have done some practical combat related stuff, although I've never actually owned a sword. I have show thing. But,
I will lay my cards on the table here that I own 3 swords.
I have never owned a sword.
They're
I own a $5 machete from Walmart.
They're all of the ceremonial pattern, I should say. But I'm making fun here, but I'm making fun mostly with love. I would say 70% with love. I think, especially towards the sort of the reenactment thing, you can learn a lot about how it is practical to hold stuff, how it's practical to move in armor, what kind, as you said, what kind of bruises you get left.
Yeah, experimental archaeology is a completely legitimate and well-established field of material history stuff. And often the result is to sort of solidify some of the questions that people have been walking around but haven't quite figured out how to answer them, or, to frame them right, as like, what exactly are we looking for when we're studying this stuff? And often, building a model or trying to reproduce something is a better way of getting at clearer questions than just going over the same material over and over again. Although it is usually, like, when it's done the best, it's about establishing questions and parameters and this sort of stuff, rather than giving you actual answers. Again, ambiguity is your friend. It's going to be here. Just live with it. On the other hand, there's sort of a temptation to sort of push this stuff a little too far. I mean, we've already run into this with the interpreting skeletal trauma of going a little too far with interpretation. And one of the biggest issues with this aspect of the experimental archaeology, or that aspect of historical inquiry, is about analogs. We don't have equivalent people to our medieval combatants. So anything a modern person does with a sword, no matter how authentic the sword is, no matter how authentic the target is, there are a bunch of variables that we can't account for.
Making Ben Shapiro get dysentery in order to more authentically wield.
There was Ben Shapiro in a genuinely life-threatening scenario.
we have to go back and give Ben Shapiro like a lifelong mild malnutrition.
Yeah.
There was a paper from
I don't think he could be smaller than he is.
Well, his sword gives him a bit of scale. Actually, maybe that is just a regular katana. He's just he'd be like 4 feet tall. I mean, he does have a string holding up his. It's probably hard to get.
He's the katana guy, and everyone around him has claymores.
I mean, I'm sure.
It's really fast, guys. It's really light.
I've seen a guy, I'm sure, at a street fair who was like a vampire hunter. So I'm positive he had a sword under his duster. But I also wasn't worried because I knew he didn't know what he was doing. So I guess that's the other thing. This is the appeal of the sword, is that people think it's something you can do. You can pick it up. You can learn how to do this on your own. I mean, there's a lot more YouTube videos than there was when I was a youth interested in swinging sticks. And you can't get books from it's Paladin Press anymore about urban longsword or something like that.
Yes, yeah.
Actually, there is one book from them. It came out in like 1981. Was it something about the Secret of Steel? It is actually useful because it's a collection of anecdotes from some cop, which has a lot of knife fights in it. So from that sort of point of view, it's kind of interesting. But anyway, I digress. There are some legitimate, serious studies of this. The London Longsword Academy is one group that is doing this appropriately with the right sort of attitude. They're not trying to teach people to how to defend themselves on the street against muggers with their broadsword. They're actually teaching them this is what learning to fight in this style would look like, not necessarily even what this style is. Because that's a distinction people miss, is that when you have all of these fight texts, you have these schools starting up, they're not necessarily teaching you how to fight. They weren't at the time. They were teaching you how to do this particular set of moves from this particular instructor. This is much closer to people, like how people learned how to stage fight. And that went on to influence how people choreographed fights in film, which then goes on to influence how people think fights with a sword are supposed to look like. So you get battlefield situations like Kenneth Branagh's Henry V, where the two armies hit each other and then they all pair off into twos and wail away at each other.
Very technical, sort of like sword on sword.
Yeah, because that's how you learn how to fight in stage. That's the easiest way to choreograph fights. The more accurate one is something like, what's his name? Is it Eisenstein? The Alexander Nevsky, the 1939 film with it, where they
looks like a riot.
Yeah, no one knows how to stage fight, but they do know how to stay together in a wall and walk towards a camera, and you get this incredibly claustrophobic feeling, which is, I think, a perfect representation of what actual combat would be like. But that's not what we've been conditioned to think fighting looks like. We see a lot of samurai films. We see, a lot of this sort of stuff. And that's how you start to imagine this. This primes you for what to expect. And so it feeds into itself, and you get this sort of self-perpetuating unreality. Whereas a more accurate fight sequence, I'll avoid digressing into any other examples. But the point is,
you're up there stanced up with a rapier, about to do the greatest sword fight in history. By the way, greatest sword fight in history, 1965 film, The Gray Race. Anyway, you're up there, you're stanced up, and you just get domed by a claymore and you die instantly.
Roy with Liam Neeson, with him and Tim Roth, that fights from a choreography point of view is pretty well done because it's shot with a wider lens. You see more movements go at one time, and Liam Neeson gets exhausted pretty quick because he's fighting with like a 3-pound sword. That is actually a pretty good fight sequence as far as sword fights are concerned. But they don't always look like good fights because of how you're conditioned to expect them to look by film.
I say this from a position of complete ignorance here. But the only thing that has ever given me a frisson of sort of history, right, is watching footage of riots. There was a period at the very end of the attempted Egyptian revolution. Breaks my heart to have to say attempted, where the regime attempted to mobilize just guys, and their supporters were on camels, and they rode into Tahrir Square on camels, and you had a genuine sort of engagement between a very angry mob on foot and a bunch of guys who had ridden into a crowd, and the way that went down was so chaotic and so horrifying that I'm just like, oh, okay, I am watching sort of a use of cavalry that is being met with force, and it is not pretty for either side, and also it has a slight air of comedy because it's camels instead of horses.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, that's probably as far as I should go with any of my comments on this stuff for now.
Well, I mean, this is the last slide that I put in, so this is what we've learned about swords.
Did we learn anything?
I learned a lot. I
learned a lot.
you don't have to sound quite so obligated.
I'm sorry that despite yourself, you've learned from this. You can just work on forgetting all of it before it airs, and you'll be.
Any of you are considering a sword fight, and I just want to say, he who fights and runs away may live to fight another day.
That's genuinely a sort of an infantry doctrine, and certainly in antiquity this is the reason why like your Spartans or your Sacred Band of Thebes are notable, is because they cohere and they stay and they fight and they get killed, because it's understood that almost everybody, even in your full hoplite armor, at some point your shield wall breaks, and the game then becomes, how quickly can I drop everything and run? That's most of ancient combat, and it stayed that way for a long time.
The survivability onion has always been relevant.
Yes. There's an inner core of the survivability onion, which is have good running sandals.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for coming on.
Yes, thank you for coming on. This was good.
If people want to find out more about your work, where can they go? What can they do?
Oh, they can download my doctoral thesis from the Oxford thesis. I do have a Twitter account. It very rarely talks about this sort of stuff. It's mostly me complaining about the current academic job market, and I retweet cats. So I got a blog that's linked off that. It's got like one entry on it so far. I will probably produce more in time now. You can, best bet is to help me find a job, and then you can come take courses from me someplace.
Yeah, so go do that.
Yes. Go get the good doctor into your university.
That's right. Go to your university's administration building and show them this episode and be like, hire this man immediately.
Well,
I will fight
like I
John
said, it is going on the CV. So, I mean, your Patreon numbers are helpful that way. So,
yeah, go to your administration and say, give us a proper military history program and get this guy to do it, or else occupy a building. Fuck it.
The military history.
You've learned some tactics.
You're gonna wind up at VMI.
That doesn't help, guys.
You want to go to VMI? You don't want to go to VMI.
They'll just hold the classes someplace else. It's okay.
Well,
actually, I looked at a possible application to VMI, but they don't hire non-Americans. Matter of fact.
What?
Hokey, hi.
Ridiculous.
Yeah. That does sound about right.
I appreciate they say that out front, as opposed to places that make me do the whole application thing and then 2 hours later say, "Oh, actually, we won't support green cards." Oh, okay, thanks, guys.
I'm sorry, you can't. You can't teach at VMI because you're from Canada.
We're 1812 round 2, baby.
They still don't trust us.
I'm hungry.
All right. Yep.
All right.
Thank you for being patrons.
Thank you.
We will try and have a more consistent release schedule from here on, but we can't commit to that or indeed anything. Just, if you like this, continue to subscribe. Bye.
Yes.
Thanks. Bye.